Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And today I wanted to talk about a study that dives into a pretty fraught topic, and even more fraught, the relationships between the socioeconomic status that people have and intelligence. Or at least, what we're currently broadly, colloquially conceive of as being intelligence, right? And the reason that I like to dive into this morass is because this is a study that seems to have been conducted by a group who's sensitive to the complexity and the nuance of human intelligence. And so this is a group at the University of California in Berkeley, and they were working with neuroimaging data from over 6,000 children in the United States. And the kids were from various points along the socioeconomic spectrum. Some are, were or were not affluent. And so past assessments have shown that when the performance of kids on various tests of cognitive function are performed, kids who are confronting poverty tend to do worse on those types of cognitive tests. However, this group notes that there's a pretty meaningful contingent of kids growing up in poverty who do just as well on these types of tests as their more affluent counterparts. So, while the injustice of kids growing up in impoverished circumstances is, of course, the sort of central concern when it comes to making sure every kid has every opportunity to develop into whomever they want to be, this group is interested in what it is exactly that's going on in the brains of kids who grow up in those thoroughly challenging circumstances who seem to be testing as though they're not confronting those socioeconomic challenges. And so, in other words, getting scores on those tests that look just like the scores of kids growing up in affluent conditions, or even better scores. And so we're going to talk about some networks of brain regions that go by horrible names, the lateral frontoparietal network and the default mode network. Super irritating, I know. But just think of these as being two different constellations of brain regions that tend to talk to each other in different circumstances, right? Or different situations. Sort of like, there are different things in a house that can need to be fixed, right? A room goes dark, and flipping on a switch doesn't make it bright again. The lights won't work, right? So several things can potentially explain what's going on there, right? It could just be that the light bulbs, or I guess LEDs these days, burned out, right? Or it could be that something associated with the electrical wiring in the house that, powers the lights has some kind of problem. So different types of solutions would be necessary to solve both of those problems, right? If the bulbs are burned out, no matter what you do with the electrical wiring, even if you bring in the best electrician in the world, nothing that the electrician does is going to illuminate that room. And on the flip side, if it's the wiring of the room, no matter how many times you change that light bulb, nothing's going to illuminate that room again until you get that electrician in to solve that wiring problem. Different strategies to solve different but related problems. Similar sort of situation here, right? There are different networks of brain regions that are recruited under different circumstances. The lateral frontoparietal network in the brain, it becomes active when you're doing certain things, right? Confronted with like certain challenges or circumstances, while the default mode network is active under different situations, right? Different tools, different jobs. So the lateral frontoparietal network, which is sometimes also called the central executive network, so it's a whole constellation of brain regions, right? The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the posterior parietal cortex. As always, it's not particularly important to know the names of those brain regions, but if anybody had the same predisposition that I had before I got into science, to take a bit of a stamp collector's approach to understanding the brain and wants to learn all the technical names of the brain and the regions of the neurotransmitters, that's what they are. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, those are the main brain regions that compose the lateral frontoparietal network. Now, the default mode network, on the other hand, is probably one of the most studied networks of brain regions in the history of neuroscience, if not the single most studied brain regions, or networks of brain regions, at least in cognitive neuroscience. And so, just like the lateral frontoparietal network, the default mode network is a large constellation of brain regions, which you can see here in this beautiful DTI imaging. Okay, so those yellow blobs, like right here, those are the main sort of like hubs within the brain, the major clusters of neurons in different regions of the brain that then communicate with each other via all those pathways connecting them, right? All those lines, all those differently colored fibers between them. So this is one of the more beautiful images generated using diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI. But anyway, so we're looking at the inferior parietal lobule areas or angular gyrus, the medial prefrontal cortex, and maybe some early visual processing areas within the visual cortex. I'm not 100% certain on that one when it comes to this image. But the sort of like most central regions of the default mode network, for my fellow neuroscience stamp collectors, are the posterior cingulate cortex, the angular gyrus, and the medial prefrontal cortex. Medial prefrontal cortex. Medial. Okay. Because the prefrontal cortex is a large brain region and it's involved in both of these separate networks. Okay, so what the default mode network is most associated with is daydreaming. Activity in this network is associated with those moments when you're sort of like zoning out, right? Not really thinking about or paying attention to the things that are happening around you. You're just sort of like checking out, and your mind is drifting wherever it drifts, right? But the most important point about the default mode network in the context of this study is that if you're focused on solving some specific problem before you, if you're having a conversation, or you're totally captivated by a video game, or more importantly, if you're taking a test, right, your default mode network is not likely to be particularly active. Okay, so those are the main two networks of parts of the brain on which we're focusing today for this study. And so you can see the default mode network there on the left-hand side with the medial prefrontal cortex prominently displayed, the MPFC right here, towards the top of the brain, front of the brain. And then the central executive network, again, another name for our frontoparietal network on the other side of this image, right? And so when you see the central executive network, think lateral frontoparietal network, right? Basically the same thing. And so this isn't an image from the study in which we're going to focus today, but it has that salience network slice of brain at the top there, right? So the concept here is that there's a kind of switchboard, right? A kind of like mechanism in the brain that functions kind of like a switchboard. And I guess a switchboard is basically meaningless these days. I suppose a switchboard really only existed as a metaphor when I was a kid, and that's what it looks like. So a switchboard was a device, I guess, that was used to connect people who were making phone calls back in the day. So when you called someone, there would be a light that would, illuminate on that panel in front of this person, the operator. And then the person who wanted to make a call would identify the person with whom they'd like to speak to the operator. Speaking it, the operator would then physically connect the caller to the person that they were trying to reach. Kind of bananas, right? Sort of like blows my mind to review that history. That's how phones used to work. But anyway, so that's kind of sort of what the salience network is, what it's doing. What's the challenge that the brain is facing? What are you facing right now? If it's one kind of problem, then the salience network or operator will activate the default mode network, right? If it's a different kind of problem, it'll activate the lateral frontal parietal network or the central executive network. So depending on the situation and how the brain was developed, those two networks of brain regions will become activated. Different tools, different demands. Okay, so those are the main two networks of brain regions on which this study is focusing when trying to understand, what it is about the patterns of brain activity in young people who grow up in impoverished circumstances who perform just as well in cognitive tests as young people who grow up in more affluent circumstances. The default mode network and the lateral prefrontal, or the lateral parietal, the lateral frontoparietal network. So two different networks, right? And so here's what they expected. Here was their hypothesis. So they expected that kids who scored higher on cognitive tests would have patterns of brain activity that were stronger within each of those networks than between each of those networks, right? So in other words, they expected that the kids who did the best on the test, right, that they were doing, would use either one of those two networks the most, and that they wouldn't have very much interaction between them, right? Those two independent constellations of networks of brain regions wouldn't really interact very much with each other. That was our hypothesis. And then the kids who did worse on those cognitive tests would have a bit of interaction between those two networks, right? They weren't strictly distinct. And so the core hypothesis being that kids from households confronting impoverished circumstances, when compared to those from affluent circumstances, would both get the same scores on cognitive tests, who both get the same scores on cognitive tests, maybe using largely distinct patterns of brain activity to get the same scores, to get the same high scores, right? Different strategies, growing up in different conditions, applying different strategies to get the same high scores, right? That's the basic concept, right? Two different routes which take about the same time, amount of brain real estate, but use different roads within the brain to get to exactly the same place at the same time. So they were working with about 1,030 kids between 9 and 10 years old, pretty young, who were in households below the poverty line. and then they had 5,805 kids from households who were likely above the federal poverty line, right? And so they had test scores, they had resting state fMRI, and demographic characteristics like household income, most importantly, right? And so, by the way, anybody who's unfamiliar, the poverty line is actually a specific number that's literally defined by governments, and it changes every year, right? So in the United States, for example, for a single person under 65 years old, that number is about $13,000 per year. For a family of 4 with 2 children, it's about it's a bit over $26,000 a year. That's the poverty line, and this obviously will vary, according to where specifically a person lives throughout the country. Different parts of the country are more expensive to in which to reside, but I actually don't think that the federal number actually does change according to region, which is kind of bananas. But anyway, so the point, that's the point, right? Is that this is the income level that's considered to be the minimum amount that's deemed adequate, right? And it's based on a calculation of the costs of all the bare essentials. And so there's a whole separate conversation regarding how it is exactly those costs are identified and selected, but that's the line that this group of scientists is using. And I think there are reasonable critiques to be made regarding the reliance on that specific number to define impoverished circumstances. Critiques with which I bet that the scientists themselves of this paper would probably agree. But I also think it's defensible to rely on that indicator for the fundamental question that they're asking. Does income level and access to resources literally change the strategy that the brains of developing young people are using to solve cognitive problems, right? That's the central question. And so they had these kids do 3 different tests, cognitive tests: matrix reasoning, the flanker test, and the dimensional change card sort task. Okay, those are the 3 tests. And I'll be honest, I've never heard of those tests, let alone ever taken them, at least to the best of my knowledge. But so here's an example from the matrix reasoning test, which basically assesses overall intelligence using like spatial problems, right? And then here's an example of the flanker test, and where the goal is to test what's called response inhibition, where they're sort of testing whether someone can effectively control the kind of like natural or easiest, most intuitive response in favor of the correct response. And so it basically tests if someone can like pay close attention to something and not be distracted by the easier choice, right? So like in this case, the question is pick the arrows that match the arrow in the center, okay? And then the dimensional change card sort task. So basically the concept here is to match cards according to some kind of category, right? So in this case, the categories are either color or shape. And so, not super difficult, obviously, but, we're talking about pretty young people here. And as a father of actually now a 3-year-old, those types of capabilities that those of us who are a little bit older kind of take for granted are still developing when we're younger, right? Even years older than my daughter. But so those are the 3 tests with which they're working for this study. And okay, so there's more to how they did the study, but let's just get into it. Okay, so first of all, there's a reason that they had the hypothesis that they did, right? So past studies have suggested that the lateral frontal parietal network operates independently from the default mode network, right? We can get rid of these. So that the past evidence does indicate that they do tend to operate independently of one another, and so specifically the concept is that to focus on the task at hand, the default mode network probably needs to be inhibited. Right? That would be the sort of like anatomical hypothesis. And so in other words, like the drive to focus inwardly, to think about things that have little to do with what's going on around you, that drive needs to be inhibited for someone to attend to a task at hand. It's kind of tough to do very well on a test if you're like zoning out and thinking about what you're going to do during the weekend or your crush or the guitar you're dying to get, right? Those instances are where, when the default mode network would start getting all active, right? And if you're taking the SAT, right, you're thinking about all that stuff isn't exactly helpful, right, or useful, thinking about the guitars you want to get when you're supposed to be taking the SAT, right? Okay, so let's get into like the main nugget of what they found. There's a link between certain patterns of brain activity and high scores on these kinds of tests, and that tends to occur more in affluent kids. However, and this is where the study departs from what I'd be willing to bet the scientists anticipated, there was a different pattern of brain activity that the scientists identified in the brains of kids from lower income backgrounds that's also correlated with high test scores, right? There were kids who got, in other words, like there were kids who got high scores on these tests who were from either affluent or low income backgrounds, both got high scores. However, the main finding is that the patterns of brain activity, in other words, like the strategies that the brains of kids from different income backgrounds used, were different. And so here's a quote from the senior scientist, Sylvia Bunge, I believe is that how you pronounce that? So Sylvia says, our results fly in the face of a number of prior studies, as they show that a pattern of brain network connectivity that has been associated with the strong test performance in both adults and children does not generalize to children below the poverty line. And then she says, if anything, we found the opposite brain behavior relationship for children in poverty. And this is particularly the case for those who are the most disadvantaged with regard to schooling, living circumstances, race, and ethnicity. Okay, so what does she mean by all that? So this is a figure from the study that seems to be like making the biggest waves. So first of all, in their study, many of the kids from households with family incomes below the poverty line scored as high or higher than kids from affluent households. But what distinguished that group of kids was that there is a positive relationship between cognitive performance and functional connectivity between the lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network, right? That's what's shown in the graph with the two lines on top. It's a little confusing, but the main idea is that as we move from left to right on these graphs, right, we're seeing more and more interaction between the lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network, those two independent networks, right? There's more interaction between them as we move from side to side. They're interacting with each other more and more, rather than the lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network interacting only within themselves, okay? And so, like, imagine you're on a basketball court, right? And there are two basketball teams on either side of the court. Well, they could each play their own half-court games and basically never interact with each other, talk to each other, or they could play each other, right? Interacting directly all the time while they compete. Same kind of idea here. On the left side of the graphs, we're looking at the condition where the two basketball teams aren't even talking to each other. They're totally independent. The lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network aren't really interacting with each other towards this side of the graph. But as we move rightward along the horizontal x-axis, the teams are interacting more and more. The parts of the brain that compose those two network of brain regions are interacting with each other, right, as we move side to side. So as we move upward on the y-axis, right, from low to high, we're seeing increasing test scores, right? The lower the lower test scores are toward the bottom, higher test scores are toward the top, right? Makes sense. So what this graph is showing is that as kids who grow up in affluent circumstances exhibit more and more interaction between the lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network in their brains, their test scores on these tests went down. Conversely, as kids who grew up in households below the poverty line exhibited more and more interaction between those two networks, their scores actually increased. And so in other words, the complete opposite dynamic as a function of whether they came from households with more or less wealth. Okay, so what do we take away from this finding? So what they're saying is that first of all, there's not one pattern of brain activity that's associated with high cognitive performance among kids, right? That there are different strategies, different neurophysiological strategies that can be used to arrive at the same conclusion of a high test score. And on top of that, the environment in which a kid develops, whether they're from affluent or impoverished circumstances, that environment seems to play a pretty big role in determining which strategy the developing brain will use, specifically when it comes to acting on these kinds of tests, these cognitive tests. So of course my wife, a scientist herself, had an immediate question. Okay, but what does it mean that these two brain networks are interacting with one another? That's a fantastic question. And it's a question that I'd be willing to bet that this team of scientists has already started asking halfway through the study, right? Because the study does not answer that question. We can speculate though. So the default mode network, again, is associated with daydreaming and being introspective and just sort of zoning out, right? You're not really focused on any one particular task in front of you. You're almost meditative, right? You're almost meditating. The lateral frontal parietal network, on the other hand, is more associated with those moments when you're like locked in on a particular task, goal-oriented tasks, right? Like me, when I was cooking my world-famous persimmon bread for Christmas. So I was super focused on making sure that each ingredient was measured perfectly and precisely, right? I was making sure that the meniscus on the measuring cups were like perfectly level at the right amount. I was focusing on my new hand mixer, making sure that each little nugget of flour and cane sugar and nutmeg and mushed up persimmon was like perfectly mixed in, right? I was really focused. So I rarely ever bake, to be clear. I really have to pay close attention to what I'm doing and make sure I don't mess everything up. So in other words, as a result of that, as a result of my lack of experience, my default mode network, the neurons in the brain regions that are part of the default mode network, they were all shutting up and inactive, right? And I'd be willing to bet that my lateral frontal parietal network was taking center stage, right, and like highly active. And so we can sort of speculate as to what that means, right, as these two networks were interacting more and more in kids from impoverished households who just crushed these tests. Perhaps it's just the case that they simply don't have the luxury of having long stretches of time to just zone out, right, think inwardly, and experience meditative states, right, because they're just more regularly confronted with very real and very tangible stressors in their day-to-day lives, right? Things like whether there's going to be dinner tomorrow, or if mom and dad are going to be able to come home in time to like feed their siblings, or if they're going to have to do extra shifts, late into the night, their parents, right? These kinds of things. And, every young kid experiences stress, right? Of course. But the differences between the sources of stress that kids in impoverished households are confronting are, potentially quite a bit more unavoidable, right? And conspicuous and compromising, right? The precarity involves things like whether they're going to go to bed hungry, right? So all that to say, perhaps part of the explanation is that for whatever reason, kids from affluent households simply have the luxury of being able to like lean on the default mode network more regularly. And so their brain is just more likely to use it independently of their like time to focus, game time, lateral frontal parietal network. That's totally speculation. Okay, so there are a bunch of other things that this group measured. And I think some of these data can help us to speculate at least a little bit. So for example, in that first panel, neighborhood safety, the kids who were growing up in the safest neighborhoods tended to show the best test scores, right? When those two brain regions, the lateral frontal parietal network and the default mode network, when those two brain regions interacted the least, right? Higher safety, less interaction. Conversely, for kids who were growing up in the most dangerous neighborhoods, those kids show the best test scores when those two brain regions interacted the most, right? So that's not exactly surprising, given that affluent households will generally be in areas that have lower crime, just in general. And we know, from the last graph of their findings that kids, this one, so kids from more affluent households tended to do better on these tests when those two networks interacted less, right? And kids from impoverished households tend to do better when the networks interacted more, right? Okay, so that's neighborhood safety. And then public versus non-public schools, which includes both private schools, charter schools, and I know that these sorts of granular distinctions are starting to mean less and less to people outside of the United States, but just bear with me. The same kind of situation is persisting here. Kids growing up in public schools tended to do the best on these tests when those two brain networks were interacting more. Kids growing up in private schools or charter schools tend to do the best on these tests when these two brain networks barely interacted with each other at all. Okay, complete opposite relationship. And then finally, we see that level of parental education, right? That the level of education that the kids' parents completed also has an effect, but it isn't the same as wealth, safety, or public versus private school. So basically, test scores improve for the kids of parents who either came close to finishing high school or finished college, right? As the two networks tended to interact more. Okay, so in other words, there wasn't this big difference between how much the two networks of brain, neurological or brain networks, right, networks of brain regions, interacted as a function of whether their parents completed high school or college. They both improved. They both improved as test scores improved, right? But the kids of parents who didn't have degrees from college, the red line, they tended to have an even greater improvement in their test scores, as those two networks of brain regions interacted more and more. Okay, so what do we learn? Oops. It's this. So what do we learn from this study? So, we strictly learn at least one thing. Okay, so there are two neurophysiological strategies that the brain can deploy to solve exactly the same problem, right? These cognitive tests. And the affluence of a kid's upbringing appears to have a pretty significant influence over which strategy the kid's brain will tend to deploy. That's really the central finding. So as the study's principal investigator, the senior scientist says, so, our study results fly in the face of a number of prior studies as they show that a pattern of brain network connectivity that had been associated with a strong test performance in both adults and children does not generalize to children below the poverty line, right? As we said before. And so, in other words, there isn't a single pattern of brain activity that correlates with acing the test, right? There's not a singular optimal pattern of brain activity. Rather, the brain can use different constellations of its neurons to solve the exact same problem just as well, right? And in fact, in some cases, one pattern of brain activity can outperform the other pattern, but also underperform the other, right? And so here's a quote from the study's lead author, the lead scientist, or I should say lead author, the first author, Monica Elwood Lowe. That sort of gets to their fundamental motivations, I think. So, quote, "A lot of research suggests that children growing up in poverty tend to do worse academically, but many of them are doing just as well, if not better, than their higher income peers," right, as we said. And so we wanted to find out what was happening in the brains of these high-performing kids in poverty based on patterns of brain development. So in other words, we wanted to see what was going right instead of looking for what could be going wrong. Right? I think it's that last sentence that really, I think reveals their central motivation. So it's an interesting fundamental goal, right? And then, as she says, overall, our findings suggest that the brains of children living in poverty might develop differently, but not less effectively, because they're up against different constraints in their home and school environments, right? End quote. So that was the speculation, right? That we just went through. Is that day-to-day life for somebody growing up under the poverty line is just materially different relative to those growing up in affluent circumstances. And that quote kind of gets to part of why I found this study interesting. And this is something that the authors note. So generally speaking, children from lower socioeconomic statuses tend to be underrepresented in studies that explore the cognition of developing children. And those that do focus on, incorporate that group, that cohort, those that do tend to focus specifically on comparing them to children from affluent backgrounds with a sort of implicit assumption. And that implicit assumption is that the patterns of brain activity that occur in the brains of affluent individuals is inherently preferable or more effective than the patterns of in the brains of less affluent individuals. And so it's an interesting approach to understanding what it is that whatever it is distinguishes what's going on in the brain of a child who's able to develop cognition that's comparable to that of a child who's not confronting the same kinds of environmental struggles that they are. But then, of course, there's this kind of intuitive assumption that, growing up in impoverished circumstances causes the brain to develop less, right? That is a sort of, I think, broadly held implicit assumption. Or maybe that it just develops less effectively. And a study like this indicates two things, right? So first of all, the brain of an individual growing up in economically disadvantaged circumstances isn't stunted, right? But there is a measurable effect of impoverished circumstances on the patterns of brain activity, used when taking a test. There is a measurable effect of access to or lack of access to wealth. So in other words, it's evidence that there is an effect of poverty, unquestionably. But the effect isn't just a deficiency in cognition. It's just not that simple. It's a difference in neurophysiological strategy. And so that might sound like a difference with no distinction, but there is a distinction there. One isn't better or more effective than the other, but they are different. And so obviously this is not a sociological study, right? This is purely illuminating the patterns of brain activity that are associated with young people, despite the challenges, associated growing up in poverty, perform just as well as kids from affluent backgrounds on cognitive tests, right? I'd be very interested in a sociological study that characterizes the environmental differences that I suspect we can all infer, right? Might distinguish, the environments of kids who are growing up in poverty who perform well on these tests from those who don't, right? Just among kids growing up under the poverty line. Because in my mind, those environmental differences could likely be tied to differences in the developmental trajectory and neurophysiology of kids. And to get a little bit more tangible here, let me just throw out, this complete speculation, okay? Let's say that the thing that distinguishes kids who grow up in impoverished circumstances but do well on these cognitive tests is simply a lack of recurrent stress, right? So this group used an income-based criterion to define poverty, which in my mind is a good criterion, but that encompasses a pretty wide variety of kids, right? So I don't think it's impossible to imagine that there are, in some cases, kids who are fortunate to be able to grow up in households who, for, a variety of reasons, that are just a bit less saturated with daily stress. And similarly, parents who are fortunate or just maybe virtuosic enough to limit, the exposure that kids have to the inevitable consequences of growing up in poverty. Right? And so, while kids who are inevitably exposed to certain consequences of growing up in less affluent circumstances, they're not exposed to some of the consequences of those circumstances, right? While many of their peers are exposed to those consequences, the obvious stressors, caprice, the instability, of those circumstances would absolutely have an effect on how the brain develops in childhood, particularly if it's just consistent, if it's a daily thing, if that's just your reality. And so the group notes that 1/5 of children in the United States live below the poverty line. It's literally, the first line in the publication, actually. And so, I say that the topic of intelligence is fraught, right? I say that because intelligence has been studied for a very, very long time, right? And it's been studied by people approaching the topic from a whole variety of disciplines: statistics, psychology, sociology, economics, and more recently, neuroscience and genetics. And there's unquestionably a history of this topic being probed by people who had political agendas, right? It wasn't just, the quest for knowledge. They had a political agenda who highlight, certain data that support their, specific policy goals. Looking at you, Charles Murray, right? And so, the reality is that human intelligence is incredibly complex, right? There are so many manifestations of human intelligence, from disciplines like mathematics and science to economics and politics and athletics, and then art and music and literature. These are all wonderful manifestations of, the human brain, exploring entirely new patterns of brain activity, right, in entirely new circumstances over time, right, to produce entirely new wonderful creations, and, to change the universe in tangible and real ways. And this study helps us to understand that there isn't any one specific optimal way that the brain can solve a problem, that it has multiple ways that it can, solve problems, and that the environment and life experience, nurture as opposed to nature, plays a major role in determining just how our brains approach these problems. All right. I know this was a bit of a longer one. So if you dig these kinds of discussions, maybe you'll consider subscribing and liking and doing all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I'll see you on another Sunday with a new topic. Thanks for watching. Hey, Watchmaker, Happy New Year. Did you stop the podcast that you used to post on the site? Yeah, well, I didn't explicitly. I didn't intentionally stop it. But COVID over the past 2 years, has just made it basically impossible for my wife and I to balance all, time in a way that makes sense while still working. So yeah, that's why, her time is super stressing. So before we could sort of juggle, the responsibility of our kid and stuff like that. But these days, in my podcast, same goes for my podcast host, right? But were learning disabilities and low economically derived kids checked? I don't think that they didn't check for that, right, specifically, but the kids had to take these tests, right? And so they had to at least be able, to get, a meaningful score. And so if somebody had very severe, developmental disabilities, they probably wouldn't be able to be incorporated into their sample population. But I'm not, I don't know that there was an exclusion criterion. I think it's a byproduct of you relying on these cognitive tests. Hey, Frank, great summary. Thank you. But was there an overwhelming movement of one network towards the other? A moved to B instead of B to A. In the results where the combination networks resulted in better results. That's very interesting. I didn't see any data that, basically the relative magnitudes. Like, for example, I think I know where you're going with this, right? Like, let's say that, among kids growing up under the poverty line who tended to do better, just in general, that cohort tended to do better as these networks of brain regions interacted more. Was one of the networks more important, right? Or was it sort of driving the activity whereas, the other network sort of supplemented a little bit? My bet is that yes, that's probably how it happens. It's not just equal, representation of the brain networks. And, it would be very interesting once, for example, for kids growing up in affluent circumstances, or not necessarily affluent, just above the poverty line. But that includes kids growing up in affluent circumstances. They tend to do better when they had greater activity in the default mode network. And so one could imagine that for kids growing up under the poverty line who tended to do better when these networks were interacting, it could be the case that they had just more activity in the lateral frontal parietal network, and then they just happen to have a little bit more DMN activity, default mode network, just a little bit more, right? And it was never 50-50. My bet is that is how it went. But yeah, we don't have any data that speak to that. I am sure they're going to follow this study up with a whole bunch of studies that explore those kinds of nuances, because it's published in Nature. So, the scientists did pretty well for themselves. Lead exposure also, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is like an ongoing tragedy in this country. The number of children, people, of course, but children in particular, given that lead is neurotoxic, permanently damages brain development. And those of us who are adults, I mean, lead is still very, very bad to consume, but at least our brain is finished developing, and so, or at least mostly finished in my case. So the most of the development has already taken place, and so the way I think about it is that like early lead exposure or traumatic brain injury or any kind of injury to the brain, early brain injury is sort of like if you have two boats, docked on the coast of California or whatever, pointing towards China across the Pacific Ocean, and in one of them, they're just pointed directly there, and then as they get close to the port, you have some sort of traumatic brain injury in your 30s, your 40s or whatever, and you turn the steering wheel, and so you just sort of veer off course. But if you do that, if you have a brain injury, if you're exposed to lead or any kind of neurotoxin, when you're developing, it's like you turn the steering wheel right at the beginning, right as the boat is leaving California's coast. And so that boat will end up way off course, right? Because that change happened very early on in the trajectory of the boats, right? So that's why like exposure of children to things like lead is so bad for them and just for society in general. And so yeah, I mean, they didn't get into that either. They were basically, the reason that this study has made waves is that they're contradicting orthodoxy, right? And so it's like, first of all, there's no one singular effective optimal pattern brain activity to ace a cognitive test, or indirectly meaning to think effectively, right? There's no one optimal pattern, and exposure to resources and wealth when you're growing up will determine the degree to which these two independent networks of brain regions either interact or don't. And you can do really, really well in these tests whether they interact or they don't. But if you happen to be growing up under the poverty line, generally speaking, you'll do better on these tests if these networks of brain regions do interact. So yeah, it's an interesting study. Anyways, thanks so much for joining me. I know it's been a while. Hope you all had a lovely New Year and holidays and everything. And cheers to a much, much better, knock on wood, 2022 than 2021. And otherwise, if you enjoy this, maybe you'll consider liking and subscribing and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, I will see you on another Sunday. Have a great week, everybody.